Okay, so good morning. We're in class 29 in Touching a City's Soul. We're up to actually on page 142, but I think there was a request at the end of last class to review a little bit because it's, this is the Sikha. It certainly reads like a maamarim in a certain way, feels kind of very dense with a lot of different ideas that we're trying to pull together, and a lot of deep ideas. So just to set the context again, so the previous Rebbe is in Chicago at this time, and it's on Shabbos, the 13th of Shvat, which, as we mentioned, actually winds up being the day that his mother passed away, but he doesn't know it yet because it's Shabbos, or doesn't know it physically anyway because it's Shabbos. So he is talking about the significance of the day, which is Shabbos Shira, which is the Shabbos that we read the story of the Jewish people crossing through the Red Sea and singing what's called Shiras Hayam as Yashir. That part of davening we do, it is actually part of the daily davening. And because they are saying that Shira, that song, the whole Shabbos is called Shabbos Shira, the Shabbos of song. So he's talking about the Maharal and the customs that he had on that day and the beauty of customs, the importance of passing along customs. And then he went into this idea of what does the idea of Shabbos Shira signify in the light of Chassidus, because all of Torah is unchanging and all of Torah is eternal, and Hashem is constantly recreating the world. So that means that we're re-experiencing Shabbos Shira, every Shabbos Shira, afresh and anew and in its totality. So how do we understand this on a deeper level? And begins by talking about this idea of Hashem creating the world, something from nothing. We see the story, and that's how we know that Torah is eternal. We're re-experiencing everything all the time. That we take the first verse of the Torah, Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz, that in the beginning Hashem created heaven and earth, and we are going to break that up and sort of re-explain each of the words on a deeper level. That Bereishis, which usually is translated as in the beginning, because Bais means in and Bereishis means the beginning, and to retranslate it as Beis Reishis, the two firsts. There's two first things. One is Torah is like a first, and the Jewish people are called a first. So therefore, it's in the merit of Torah and the Jewish people, Hashem created the heaven and the earth. And then it talks about the Torah is divided into sections so that we read a section every week, which of course is also connected to this idea of Shabbos Shira. And that each of those weeks infuse an energy, each of those Torah portions infuse an energy into that week. And each of the Torah portions infuse an energy into the soul of the Jewish person, right? And when they get an aliyah to the Torah, infuses his 5 levels of the soul and the 5 levels of creation with a godly light, which we're going to come back to that idea at the end of this Sikha, what that means on a deeper level, and then goes into the fact that this revelation of godly light that's felt from each Torah portion is felt on all levels of the soul. That idea is sort of like, okay, here it is, and then it goes back to this pasuk, the first pasuk of the Torah, that in the merit of these two things, Torah and the Jewish people, Hashem created heaven and earth. Now we retranslated on a deeper level the first half of the pasuk, that it's not just in the beginning, but it's actually for two things that are called the beginning, that Hashem created heaven and earth. Now we're going to retranslate the last half of that pasuk, which is Abara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz, that Hashem created, Elokim created the heaven and the earth. So the word created can be retranslated as revealed, and Elokim, which is the name of God that's used in this verse, is now sort of expounded upon in its depth. Which name of Hashem is that? It's the name of Hashem that enclose itself in nature, which makes sense because Hashem is creating the natural world. So it's going to be his aspect of him that encloses itself in itself in nature. And that now it's actually saying that these two things, the Jewish people, Torah, reveal and their unity, I guess in a certain sense you could say, reveal the godliness that Hashem, that Elohim implanted in heaven and earth. And that's the underlying reason for which the 5 books of the Chumash are divided into weekly readings. For each reading vitalizes the world and all of its entities and overtly lights up the 5 levels of the soul, the nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, and yechida. That, like, you could highlight that line or underline it. That's sort of the whole point that he's trying to make. And then the rest of this sikha is really sort of describing and analyzing what does that mean, that the Torah lights up the world and the 5 levels of the soul, and we reveal the hidden godliness that God implanted into creation through that. That's sort of like the theme that he's trying to explain here. So he goes on here to talk about that there's no place that doesn't have godliness, right? God implanted himself into creation. That's how the world got created, was because of Hashem created the world, and in order to do that, he put himself into creation with contractions and so on, and hysterim and hiddenness and everything else. But there's no place that's devoid of him. And even the word teva, which means nature, sort of teaches us that, because it means submerged. So it means that there's a godliness that's submerged within nature, which he's calling a natural godliness, or the natural divinity, right? That's the godliness that's submerged or hidden in nature. And our function, right? Well, read one more line also in the middle of page 141. Chassidus' function is to reveal the soul within everything, reveals the soul within nature, right? So that means Torah learning, specifically Chassidus, helps us to reveal the hidden godliness that's in nature, helps the Jewish soul to reveal. That's what our purpose is here, is to reveal the hidden godliness that's within nature. So now it talks about Torah and the fact that each of the Torah portions helps to do that. And there is a hidden godliness, and Torah tells us there's a hidden godliness that's submerged in nature. And now goes to talk about the soul, and what is the soul and how does it figure into this, right? So the soul is compared to it's in that line, the soul of man is a candle of Hashem. Obviously, it doesn't mean a physical candle. Hashem doesn't have physical candles, doesn't have need of physical candles, but everything in the physical world is a parable of some sort, as it's going to mention later on as well in a different context. But that it's compared to a candle. Obviously, a parable is only a parable. It doesn't. If it was the thing itself, they wouldn't need to be a parable. It would be the thing itself. So, but there are aspects of a parable that help us to understand the analog, right? The analogy helps us understand the analog. That's why we use them. So the candle, the soul of man, is compared to a candle. And how is it compared to a candle? The same way that the candle, tries to, if you look at the flame of the candle tries to sort of, it looks like it's trying to jump off the wick and go up, right? It's the only thing, as we mentioned, in the physical world that defies gravity. Fire goes up, everything else in the physical world goes down. So it's remarkable and therefore worth noticing that fire is the only thing that goes up. And the soul of man also has a natural propensity to be drawn up to God, and it wants to sort of be connected with Hashem, even though both the flame, if it leaves the candle, it gets nullified into its source, and the soul, if it leaves the body, also gets nullified into its source in godliness. But that's how it is. That's the nature of the soul. And then goes on to explain sort of it's almost like a side point, but it explains that when we say something is the nature, we can't say why it is that way. Science can't say why it's that way. They can only say how it is that way and what they can see from it, but why we don't know, according to science. we can only begin to understand something, the deeper message of something with Torah, of the whys, and even that we don't have that much information as to why, but sometimes there's information that is shared with us so that we can understand something on a deeper level. But here he's saying the Alter Rebbe says the nature of the soul can't be explained rationally, even the why of the soul can't be explained rationally, because as he says, it soars above the heights of rational explanation. And the Alter Rebbe does explain that the source of the soul's nature is the faculty of Chachma, which Chachma, we mentioned last time, is the first of the 10 spheres, and it's the first of the 10 soul powers. And Chachma, being the first of the 10 soul powers, is the receptacle, is the vessel to receive the godly light that's above the soul, that's going to fill the soul and put it into the body. We have to be connected to some, even our soul is, compared to our bodies, it's part of God and Ein Sof, and it's not of the physical world or anything like that. But compared to actual essence of Hashem, the soul is part of creation, because it's sort of been pulled out of the infinity of Hashem and attached to a body, just like the flame has been pulled out and attached to a wick. So we can't really capture the flame. If we try to capture it, it goes out, but we can, it is separated out from, if you have a fire, if you have a big fire in a fireplace and you put a log or a stick into it and you pull it out, so that flame is now separated from the fire in the fireplace, and you put it back in, it's back within it. But because of the wick, or because of the stick, or in our case, because of the body, so you pull out the fire, and it's almost like you have a piece of the fire, even though you can't capture, you can't grasp it, you can't hold on to it, it will disappear. The same thing is with a soul. You can't hold on to a soul. It's not a physical entity, but as it gets connected to a body, it gets sort of pulled out of that infinity to a certain extent, and it's connected to the body. So we actually talk about my soul, even though it's really a piece of God. But why are we calling it my soul? Because it's connected to my body, and therefore it belongs to me, so to speak, even though it's still a piece of godliness. So there's this dichotomy, as Malka says, we have to hold opposites, right? We're holding opposites, that the soul's at one and the same time, it's a piece of Hashem and it's part of infinity, and it's also part of creation because it's connected to a specific body and not to a different body. And it's vested in that body for a certain amount of years, and then it goes back to its source. So we're saying that the nature of this soul, if we're trying to understand it at any level, the nature of the soul, or rather we say the source of the nature of the soul, is its faculty of Chachma, and the first full paragraph on page 142, which is the receptor for the Ein Sof light, which is infinite. So with that brief statement, the nature derives from the soul's faculty of Chachma. The Rebbe throws on the entire concept of nature, throws light on the entire concept of nature, and endows it with its due status. We're going to get back to this line, which is a little cryptic here. It's a little cryptic. It is a little cryptic, or it feels a little cryptic to us anyway. The whole ends of this Sikha is going to talk about the 10 things we learn about the soul and from this statement of Alter Rebbe. He's going to get back to it and explain it a little bit more later on. But he sort of, I don't want to say digresses, because he's not digressing. In the next section, the previous Rebbe wants to explain what it means to use terminology that helps us understand something, when, especially in the context of a concept that we can't really understand. Meaning, he's trying to, right now, he's trying to explaining about Torah and its essence and what it does in the world, and the fact that the Jewish soul and Torah are supposed to partner in, revealing godliness in the world. And now he's going to the Jewish soul and trying to explain what it is. And he sort of stops here and he says, this is the nature of the soul, though you can't understand it, because nature is something that's incomprehensible. It's something that's above reason in general. We can never explain why the nature of something is that way. We can just describe the nature. And that goes for the soul too. We can't really describe why the soul is the way it is, we can just explain that it is because its source is in the Chachma. And now that he says that statement, he doesn't explain what that means yet. Then he goes into talking about this idea of talking these deep concepts in a way through parables that helps us understand something. So it's almost like this whole section is almost going to be like in a parentheses. Like while we're mentioning that we can't really completely understand what the nature of something is in Torah, and the Al-Jab is telling us that it's because the nature is from Chachma. Hold on to that thought for a minute. I'm going to explain to you what it means to like talk in parables and explain things so that we can understand them more. Then we're going to go back to this idea that the nature of the soul is from Chachma and what that means. He's going to tell us like 10 things that we learn about that, and we learn about the soul from it and so on. But it's almost like he has to explain to us this idea of, using a parable. It's the soul of man is like the candle of God, of, all these kinds of ways that we talk, because he just said whatever we say doesn't explain the whys. And, so like, why do we do it anyway? Then why do we talk this way? What are we saying these things for? What do we learn from saying these things? And he's going to talk about how these parables help us to understand as much as we can understand. So that's why we talk this way, even though it doesn't capture the entire truth or the entire essence when we're talking about something, to use these parables. But first he's going to explain why we do use these parables, and then he's going to go back, or not even just the parables, but even why does the Alter Rebbe say that the nature of the soul is from the faculty of Chachma? What does that mean? Meaning, by the Alter Rebbe saying this, so it's not just a parable, it's also like the definition. I guess it's both things. Alter Rebbe is defining that this is where the nature of the soul comes from, or he's like explaining this is where the nature of the soul comes from. So by doing that, he's accomplishing something. We don't necessarily understand the whole full significance of what he's accomplishing until later on in the Sikha. The Friedrich Rebbe will have mercy on us and explain these 10 things that we learn from it. But first, again, he's going to talk now about this idea of different levels of knowledge and different ways of talking, and why Torah uses these kinds of phrases and those kinds of phrases, and how they all help us understand something that's kind of esoteric. So that's a review. So how are we doing?
It's still a little rough, but it's getting better.
Yeah, it is a little rough. I mean,
yeah. Because he's doing it backwards, he's giving us like an overview, but we really need to have each section really explained and easier to understand. Each concept explained rather than him giving the big reveal at the end.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously he has, I'm not sure that he's only trying to get to the big reveal. Do you know what I mean? I think he's along the way trying to teach us all these things as we go. Like, it's not his goal to be completely linear. It doesn't feel, I can't tell you what his goal was. I can't tell you, I cannot get, I don't know. It doesn't feel like his only goal is to be linear. It feels like his goal is also to sort of let us rise with the rising tide into all of these ideas and swim around a little bit there, and try to, assimilate some of this knowledge on our path to the next point that he's going to make.
Yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. That is a good way of explaining what he's doing.
And I think all his writing is like that. Even the stories, right? The stories that we're doing in the Shabbos class, it's like very rich the way he teaches. Is, everything is like laden with all these layers. It feels like
layer upon layer. Yeah.
You want to say something, Carolyn?
I kind of thought I followed it until the last sentence, you said. So I'm trying to understand this. And in my mind,
we all are, I'm just saying.
in other words, everything is a piece of God. So everything comes from God. So like even, but the soul in particular, you're saying comes from specifically from the closest source to the ultimate God,
Yeah.
the unself. So it's Hakma that it's coming from.
Through.
But everything
It's not coming
comes
from
an-
Chachma. It's coming through Chachma. Chachma is a vessel,
okay.
not a source.
So everything is coming from that source because God is
No.
everything,
Well,
correct?
not
But a
exactly.
different clay vessel. It comes
Not
through a different
yeah,
vessel.
right. So not right, exactly. So even though everything is coming from Hashem, obviously, there are things that have a more direct route, things that have more contraction and more hidden veils, and layers and layers of more contraction and more hidden veils, right? So it is true that everything is from Hashem, but there's something called internal will and external will. There's something called essence and, the other side, right? Even the other side comes from Hashem, comes through lots and lots of contractions and hiddenness and veils and contractions and hiddenness and veils. So even though the light is the same essential godly light, but it's more or less accessible, more or less an internal or an external will, right? There's lots and lots of contractions going on to create this world, right? So, it's like there's a parable that's given when a king makes a banquet. He makes, I'm going to just mute you because there's an echo, and then you can unmute if you have a question. When a king makes a banquet, he brings out all his finery, his cutlery and dishes, and hires the best cooks and amazing food and everything else, because he wants to entertain his officers and his noblemen, and so only the finest food, and so who benefits from that? So the officers and the noblemen, of course, have this beautiful lavish meal, and then the leftovers are brought into the kitchen, and the staff of the house also benefits from all of this leftover food, because there's much more than what the officers and it's just lavish, right? It's Kiyana Melech, everything is like with expansiveness. So there's certainly leftovers. So the leftovers are brought back to the kitchen. He's not serving his officers leftovers the next day. He's going to have a whole new meal for them, right? So the kitchen staff gets, and the whole palace staff gets to eat from the leftovers. Did the king make the food for them specifically with them in mind? No, but they get benefit from it. And even after that, when the staff of the palace finishes, so there might even be some like street urchins, poor people around the palace who still eat from the leftovers of the people who work in the palace. They get the next level of leftovers, and did the king make his banquet for them? No, not really, but they're still benefiting from it. And then even when they're done and the garbage is taken out, the dogs and cats and rats also benefit from this feast of the king, because they get to eat from the garbage. The garbage is still something that they benefit from. And certainly the king didn't have the rats specifically in mind when he made right? So there's, in other words, that's one parable that's given about, right, everything came from the king's table, but not everything had the inner intent, meaning the inner desire of the king was not for the rat, it was for his officers and family, or whatever. It wasn't for the rats, but the rats also benefited. So it's the same food that was on the king's table the rats are eating. If it is the same food, but it's not the same desire of the king to feed the rats as it was to feed his guests. That's one parable that's used sometimes to explain. So another parable, could talk about the idea of, the sunlight coming into a house, right? So the sun, it's the same sunlight that comes into every room in the house with any window, because it's just one sunlight. I mean, there's no other sunlight coming into a house. But would you say it's the same sunlight that comes into a big picture window in the living room and a small a glass block window that's covered with a curtain in the basement? It's the same source of light that's coming through, because there's no other light besides the sunlight. But it's not the same level of light that's coming through this picture window in the living room, which brightens up the whole room. You don't even need to turn a light on. And in the basement, where it's a glass block window, so there's a contraction of the light, and then now over this glass block, and the glass block window is small, it's not large, and it has a curtain over it. So it's a small window that's a glass block window with a curtain. It's still the same sunlight, but you still have to turn on the light when you get to the basement, and it doesn't warm up the room and make it feel all bright and cheery. It's there. It's the light that gives it light. It's the only light. There's no other thing besides sunlight coming into that window. But it's not this. You can't compare the level of revelation of the light in the living room picture window and in this glass block tiny window in the basement that's small and a glass block and covered with a curtain, a sheer curtain. So there's sunlight that comes through, but it's not. So everything is God. Obviously, there's nothing else besides God. I mean, that's how everything got into existence. But we can't say it's the same level of godliness in a Sefer Torah and in a pig, la'avdil. It's just not the same level of godliness. It's not the same level of revelation, not the same purpose of creation, inner will, outer will. It's very different levels here. Accessible godliness, things that are a mitzvah, things that are permitted but not a mitzvah, things that are not permitted, right? There's levels, and those are the result of contractions and veiling, contractions and veiling, contractions and veiling of godliness. So the soul has very little contraction and veiling. It's just a piece of God. A pig has a lot of contraction and veiling. It's a non-kosher animal. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, God created it for a purpose. If he didn't want it here, he wouldn't have created it. But it's not the same level of revealed godliness and purpose in creation as a Jewish soul. It just has two different purposes and two different levels of contraction and veiling. Does that make sense?
I'm nodding my head. I'm sorry. I'm not dressed actually. Today wasn't one of my mornings. So
okay.
Yeah, those good parables. Those are really good parables. It's kind of pulling things together a little bit as far as the contractions and the veiling. I always this world seems so real. It seems so revealed that you forget that it's all contraction. We're all contractions except for the soul.
Yeah, I mean, it is real. It's not that the world is not real. It's, Hashem wants the world this way. That's why he created it this way. It's not a mistake. It's just what is everything's purpose in creation. Its purpose is to serve God's mission, to make a dwelling place for him here. So a Torah scroll has, the Torah and the Jews have one and the same mission, and we're supposed to be partners. And everything else is a support for that mission. Some of everything else recognizes that, and some of everything else doesn't recognize that and looks like it's putting up a fight, Unfortunately.
I'm nodding my head.
What?
I said I'm nodding my head.
You're nodding your head. Thanks for the feedback, since I can't see it.
Right.
Does anything else come from the faculty of Chochmah, like the soul in existence?
The soul has these 10 faculties, not everything.
But its source is Chochmah, you're saying. It's
No, the nature of the soul cannot be explained rationally. The source of the soul's nature is the faculty of Chachma, not the source of the soul, the source of its nature. The source.
so does anything else in existence have that quality?
Well, nothing else. This is only a Jewish soul has these 10 faculties of on the side of godliness. That's the only thing that has the Eser Koichas HaNefesh on the side of godliness.
Comes from the 10 godly spheres, you're saying.
The
Nothing else
soul has 10 godly soul, but the Jewish soul has 10 godly soul powers. That's what makes it a Jewish soul.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is a pattern of 10, and there's a pattern of 10, and the contraction of this and the contraction of that light that comes from these 10, but it's not, the Jewish soul has these 10 soul powers. There's lots of things that the qualities of Chachma get contracted all the way down into the physical world in many ways, just like the 10 spheres get contracted down into the world. But the soul power is only in the human soul, and the godly soul powers on the side of godliness is only in the Jewish soul. That's what makes the Jewish soul a Jewish soul, is has these 10 godly soul powers.
So all the other spheres then aren't considered godly soul powers, you're saying?
No, they are all 10. They're called 10 soul powers, all 10 spheres. Chachma is the point, since it's the first one, it's the point of connection to that which is above the 10 soul powers, just like anything else, right? You have the highest point is going to be the point of connection. So you have that in the physical world, right? You have to, you have to have a connector. I mean, Kesser is actually the connector between the soul and Ein Sof, but Chachma is the first point of contact into the godly soul, because it's the highest of the soul powers. Of the 10 soul powers, the soul has 10 soul powers.
So how is that different in the non-Jewish soul, that they don't have the 10 soul powers? Like how is their soul described?
I believe I'm not just they have 10 soul powers. They're not called the godly soul powers. In other words, just like our animal soul also has these 10 soul powers, but they're not on the side of godliness. They're just intellect and emotions, not necessarily so connected to godliness. These intellect and emotions in the animal soul. Like it says in Tanya, God created a mirror image on the side of holiness and the side of unholiness, so that there could be an equal and opposite force. Just like, in physics, there's equal and opposite force. That's because that's true also in the way that Hashem set up the world, so that we have free choice and that we have,
So the non-Jewish soul has the animating soul, but not a godly soul.
Right. They have an animating soul. Now they can, if they accept the 7 Noachide laws and they accept Hashem as king, God, creator, whatever it is, according to the laws of the Rambam, he explains how that they can switch the nurture of their soul to godliness, but they still don't get a godly soul unless they're Jewish. Meaning, what makes the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? It's not our bodies, right? Our bodies sort of look the same. I'm saying we all have 2 eyes and 1 nose and 1 mouth and 2 ears and 2 arms and 2 legs. And I'm saying, even though people used to think that Jews had horns on their head, we don't have horns on our head. I'm saying our bodies they look the same. Our souls are different.
So with the acceptance of the Noahide laws, a non-Jewish soul can connect more to godliness
With what?
with the acceptance of the Noahide laws.
Oh, acceptance.
That would,
Yeah. Right.
that would allow.
Right. I mean, non-Jews are also part of creation. You know, right? We're in. This is not a comparative religion class, but I'm saying, like, we don't say that there's no purpose for the non-Jew in God's creation. We don't say that. God created the non-Jew. There's a purpose for the non-Jew in creation. We don't say in order to serve God, you have to convert and become Jewish. You could if you want to, but then if you want to, then you go through the same process that the Jewish people went through at the giving of the Torah. You have to accept all 613 mitzvahs, go to the mikvah, have a bris. You basically, you make your body a vessel for a godly soul, and then you receive a godly soul. But you don't have to become Jewish to serve God. That's not the goal. Is to make this world a dwelling for Hashem. The Jews through doing the 613 mitzvahs, the non-Jews through doing the 7 Noachide mitzvahs. It doesn't say the goal is to convert everybody to become a Jew. That's not the goal. It's not even like a mission statement. It's not anything. It's you know, if a non-Jew wants to become Jewish, so they can. I mean, they're welcome. They're welcome. And then they get a godly soul the same way a Jew is born to a Jewish mother gets a godly soul. Well, it's not the same way, but the same. They both have one. this through birth, this through the halachic conversion process, and then they have a godly soul, and then they're Jewish. But a non-Jew can serve God and be godly just in a different way, which is in the non-Jewish way, with the 7 Noachide laws, and then they are fulfilling their purpose in creation.
Thank you.
How are we doing, ladies?
Chaya. So
Yeah.
how does that connect to the Torah portion?
The Torah portion,
You know,
Shabbos Shira?
yeah. You know, well, all obvious. You know, you somehow there was a connection that to what what I.
Well, I think if I understand this correctly, because it doesn't go back to Shabbos Shira specifically, but it does go back to this idea at the very end. He relates this back to this idea of, and that's why we're saying that when a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, it elevates the 5 levels of the soul. That's the idea it goes back to. In other words, that's the point of departure, and that's the idea that it goes back to. So how I understand it is, right, it starts by he's talking on Shabbos Shira. I mean, he's talking on, this talk is happening when it's Shabbos Shira. So he uses, I'm going to tell you a story and I'll go back to the question. Well, this is a very famous story about the Rebbe Rashab, the previous Rebbe's father, who, when the previous Rebbe was a young boy, went to his father and said, "Why do we have 2 eyes?" So the Rebbe Rashab, his father, said to him, "We have 2 eyes because we're supposed to look at some things with our right eye and some things with our left eye. For example, we look at a candy with our right eye and we look at another Jew with our left eye." So it's like, okay, it's a very interesting story and it teaches us a valuable lesson. So I remember one of my teachers, I think it was actually Rabbi Friedman, who said, what is the purpose of this story? Just to teach us that we have to look at things, some things we have to look at with the right eye and some things we have to look at with the left eye, like a candy we look at with our left eye and a Jew we look at with our right eye. Like, the idea of left is to push away, the idea of right is to draw close. So like a Jew we push away, a candy we push away, we don't have to like go after every candy we see. A Jew we always want to bring close and have avos. So like, that's a beautiful lesson. And probably there's a deeper lesson in the story too, besides just that idea. What is the deeper message for us? That really the Rebbe Rashab, who was known to be an educator par excellence, he had a very specific goal, especially in educating his son. He wrote actually a treatise called Chanech Lanar, where he talks about what he thinks is the method of education. He had one child, so he knew that this child needed to grow up to be the next Rebbe. So he had very specific educational practices in place for him, and he was also not well man and passed away young, and left the Chanech Lanar was really written for his wife and how to bring up their child in case he wasn't going to be there to help her bring up the child. So everything with the Rebbe Rashab has like layers and layers of something. So what is this story? So he explains that really the Rebbe Rashab wanted to teach his son this lesson. That there's some things in the world that we look at with our left eye and we need to push away, and some things in the world, or rather there's some things we need to push away and some things we need to draw close. Like that discernment is part of life and maturity and taking spiritual responsibility for ourselves, what to push away and what to let in. He wanted to teach this to his young child. His child was a young child. So how is he going to teach this to his young child? So he waited for an opportunity to connect it to something that the child was interested in or questioning or asking about or open to. It's because when somebody's open to a teaching, it goes in much better. So the opportunity came when the child asked about two eyes, to use that as an opportunity to teach about these two viewpoints, because it lends itself to that idea, these two eyes, right? So it feels to a little bit like perhaps, and I can't say for sure, but perhaps this is a little bit what the previous Rebbe is doing for us here, right? He wants to teach us a lesson. He wants to teach us a lesson that the Torah is eternal and that the world was created for the Jew and the Torah to be able to uncover the hidden godliness there is in the world. And every time we get an aliyah to the Torah, it affects all levels of creation. And our soul is, powerful piece of God that's here in the world. And like, get to it, people. He's speaking to the city of Chicago, right? Let's get with the program. Let's do this. So he's using whatever the supporting cast, whatever part of the supporting cast is going to allow him to teach us this lesson. So he's talking in Shabbos Shira. So he's talking about Shabbos Shira. What about Shabbos Shira? There's these customs. These customs are very important because in order to perpetuate Torah and Yiddishkeit and everything else, we need these customs, and that's what creates the richness. For example, the Maharal will gather children and teach them these customs. And we call this Shabbos Shira because the whole Shabbos takes on the name of the Parsha, because the Torah has an eternal, because the Jewish souls are singing Shira this week too. In other words, it doesn't just happen one time 3,000 years ago that they sang when they actually crossed the Red Sea, but it's still called Shabbos Shira right now because the Jewish souls are singing Shira today, right now, on Shabbos Shira. 3,000 years later, the Jewish souls are again singing it. Why? Because the Torah is eternal. Why? We divide up the Torah to the lesson every week, every portion of it, because it has an eternal message. It gives life to every week. And when the Jew gets an aliyah, it gives life to his soul and all of the levels of creation. And because we see it in the first, word of the Torah, and from there develops this idea of, this richness. That's how I understand it. I don't know if that's the proper only, highest level to understand it, but that's what I understand from it. That's sort of the context, which is why I keep reviewing it in that way, in that context almost. Do you know what I mean? Like that's how I understand it. Does that help?
Definitely. Thank you. No, yes.
Okay. Anything else? It's not easy things. But that's how I'm organizing it in my own mind for myself to understand. Okay, so do we want to go on to any new material today, or should we just
Yes.
what your game, Rachalea? It's like I feel like everybody wants to sort of like
No, let's go on because it's going to coalesce. The deeper we go into it, the more it's going to coalesce.
Yeah.
all righty. Just remember you asked for it when we get to the next paragraph. I'm just saying. Okay, so now we're in the middle of page 142. Okay, so now the previous Rebbe is going to talk about the way that Torah explains things. Meaning, I believe it's because he just said that the candle, that's the soul of man like a candle of God, and then all of these ideas, and we can't explain the why, we can only explain the how, and that the nature of the soul resembles the nature of the light of the candle, right? Now it's going into this idea of the different way that Torah speaks so that we can understand things. So this is a new idea. I mean, it's a new thought, right? So there is an expression of the sages that the Torah speaks in the language of mortals. That's a phrase. The Torah medaber b'lashon b'nei adam. The Torah speaks in the language of mortals. Chana, for example, when addressing God in her classic prayer, right? The one Chana, we're talking about the mother of Shmuel the prophet, who was childless for many, many years, and the story, the book of Shmuel and the book of Samuel is, she went to the Meshkan, she went to the tabernacle, and she prayed for a child, and that actually we learn most of our laws of prayer from the description of her prayer for that child Shmuel. Her prayer was accepted, and she gave birth to Shmuel, became one of the greatest prophets that ever lived. But in that description of her prayer, it says when addressing God in her classic prayer, she says, if you will indeed see, which of course we don't talk about God as seeing, right? I'm saying like, he doesn't have eyes, or, right? It's not. So if you will indeed see, or another such expression, besides that Torah speaks in the language of mortals, another expression of how the Torah speaks is another such expression, to appease the ear with what it is able to hear. Meaning that the Torah expresses itself in words that a mortal ear can absorb. Right? Because we're trying to explain godly concepts to human beings like us. It's not always so easy for us to understand these godly concepts because they're not physical they're not physical things that we can touch and see and figure out the way that science can touch and see and describe something. We can't necessarily describe everything like that we can't see and we can't touch and we don't hear, and right, it's all these ideas. Thus too it is written, the ear examines words, for hearing implies understanding. So when we're saying to appease the ear with what it's able to hear, we're talking about trying to make sure we understand something. This too is an instance of appeasing the ear by employing phrases that the listener is able to grasp. So there's two main phrases here. There are two main phrases that the Torah uses to describe how the Torah itself expresses itself. Torah speaks in the language of mortals, or the Torah uses wording to appease the ear with what it is able to hear. Those are two different phrases. These two expressions are in fact diverse. It's not the same idea, even though maybe it looks like the same idea. It's actually not the same idea. The first expression, the Torah speaks in the language of mortals, means that even though the Torah is the wisdom of God, it employs language that approaches the language of mortals. That's like, if you will see. That's how we talk to other people. If you will see, which said to Hashem, right? The Vilchana said to Hashem, if you will see. Thus, the divine wisdom conveyed in the Torah also appears in mortal language, though without being at all changed. The divine wisdom is not being changed. The second expression, to appease the ear with what it is able to hear, implies that the actual subject being transmitted undergoes a change. It means that what is said is restricted to only as much as the ear of the disciple can grasp. This is why in Rashi's paraphrase of this principle, to appease the shachach, he writes to explain, l'saber, lahasbir, to the mortal ear. So these two different ways of the Torah speaking. So now what we're trying really in a certain way, what's happening now in this section of his talk, is trying to merge these two ideas of the Torah and the Jewish soul, right? Trying to explain, well, part of our job is like, we, the Jew, needs to understand the Torah. If the Torah is what's going to give life to the world, and we have to read it every week, because that's the divinity of the week, and we have to find the godliness that's submerged in the world through Torah, so we have to be able to connect to Torah at some level. So how do we connect? We're gonna learn Torah, and there's two different ways that the Torah allows herself to be known. The Torah speaks in the language of mortals, so the divine wisdom that's conveyed in Torah is in a mortal language, but the ideas are not changed. And or to appease the ear with what it's able to hear, that the subject that's being transmitted is restricted to as much as the person can understand. The diversity of these two expressions enables us to ponder deeply on the loftiest spiritual concepts so that we can find analogies for them in the corporeal natural comprehension of mortals. In other words, that's why we can use parables. We can use parables because the Torah uses wording to appease the ear with what it's able to hear. So we can use parables even though not necessarily is it going to be exactly the same thing. So he's gonna explain this idea in more depth, these different levels of understanding and knowledge, and then go back to the idea of the soul, its nature coming from faculty of Chachma, and then go back to the idea that when a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, all 5 levels of the soul are elevated and the world is elevated and everything else. Okay? Okay. I'm not really sure it makes sense to go on, honestly, because this is going to be an example. I mean, it's the last minute of class. This is going to be an example of this idea where he was going to quote that the Mechilt on the verse in Parshas Yisro about the giving of the Torah, and then he's going to explain what we have to know, the verse from there, know this day and take it to your heart that Havai is Elokim, and he's going to explain what does it mean that it's in plural, and how, these are the 2 levels of understanding. And then how this is like an example of using things, teaching Torah in a way that to appease the ear, and then talk about how we do that with using parables and understanding things. So he's like giving an example from the giving of the Torah from a verse in that section. And then he's going to go back to this explains the idea of the nature of the soul, where the nature of the soul comes from, because it's also a way for the ear to understand. And then talk about how this affects the fact, when a person gets an aliyah, it elevates their soul. I mean, that's like basically, I guess you could say 3 sections that are left in the talk. That's where we're going. It's a Hashem. Anyway, it's already 10:30, but okay. So are we good to go?
Yes,
Looking
yes.
forward to next week.
Okay, we have to leave a cliffhanger to make sure everybody comes back, right? Anyway, okay.